I'm so proud to be joined by Congressman JAMIE Raskin for episode 2 of what is already an incredibly successful series, Debunking Right-Wing Constitutional Fallacies, called Class with JAMIE Raskin. But this episode has easily been the most requested. So today we're going to discuss the truth about what the Constitution says regarding the Second Amendment. And this is probably the amendment about which there's the most ignorance and the most exploitation. So I'll turn it over to the congressman who will discuss the question of whether the Second Amendment gives people the right to violently overthrow the government with insurrections and rebellions and to form private militias to do so. Congressman, the floor is yours.
Hey, Brian, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be back, and thanks to everybody for all the emails and texts and stuff we've been getting since we launched our class. The fallacy today, as you said, Brian, is the very commonly repeated and well-heard argument that we get from MAGA people all the time, which is that the Second Amendment gives the people the right to overthrow the government with insurrections and rebellions, and therefore to form private militias to do so. And this is the basis often for them saying that we can't have any reasonable gun safety regulation we're advancing, whether we're talking about a universal violent criminal background check or red flag laws or bans on assault weapons. So we're going to get into this fallacy to figure out just exactly how wrong it is. Now, the founders and all the great leaders of our history knew that violent insurrection would always be a persistent threat to the strength of American democracy. And I want to show you that they wrote a constitution with numerous structural safeguards built into it against violent insurrection and rebellion. They definitely did not write the Second Amendment or any other part of the Constitution in order to establish a right of violent popular insurrection against the government in the Constitution. Now, the framers were very familiar with insurrection. They saw it up close. They strongly denounced it. They put it down in 1786 in Shays' Rebellion, which was a tax revolt in Western Massachusetts. And in fact, in Federalist Number 1, the very first Federalist paper, Alexander Hamilton warned of political operators who would pander to the violent passions of mobs in order to seize power and then destroy the freedoms of the people. Charismatic political leaders who began, quote, as demagogues, as Hamilton put it, and then end as, quote, tyrants. In his famous Lyceum address of 1838, delivered after the murder of abolitionist newspaper editor Elijah Lovejoy in Alton, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln denounced mob violence and observed that if division and destruction ever befell America, it would not come from abroad, but it would come from within. And when the Confederate rebellion against the Union indeed did come from within, Lincoln sent a message to Congress on December 3rd, 1861, in which he described the Confederate insurrection as, quote, a war upon the first principle of popular government, the rights of the people, unquote, specifically the voting rights of the people and the right of the people to choose their own officials. But insurrectionism is back today. As everybody knows, it exploded in our face on January 6, 2021, when a billionaire demagogue tyrant galvanized a violent mob to block the peaceful transfer of power under the 12th Amendment of the Constitution, and then tried to coerce his own vice president to step outside of his ministerial and administrative role under the Constitution and install Trump in office over the winter. Remember, Biden beat Trump by more than 7 million votes, 306 to 232 in the Electoral College, but Trump simply wouldn't take no for an answer from the American people. Now, more than 1,000 individuals have been charged with crimes in connection with the insurrection of January 6th. More than 700 have been convicted or pled guilty to a wide range of offenses, from assaulting federal officers to seditious conspiracy, which means conspiracy to overthrow the government of the United States or to put it down by force, to obstructing Congress in a proceeding. Given the long and now also recent history of insurrectionism in America, it's amazing, although it is not surprising, that the Republican Party, following the National Rifle Association, would be advancing an interpretation of the Second Amendment today to say that it protects the right of insurrection, specifically the right of the people to keep sufficient and sophisticated arms to wage violent insurrection and rebellion against the government. And this fantasy insurrectionist reading of the Second Amendment doubles as justification for not passing common gun sense safety reform, and it operates as an excuse for 24/7 gun violence in our society, unlike anything seen anywhere else in the industrialized world. Insurrection today dresses itself up in the language of populism and constitutionalism. I remember on January 6th when I would hear loud chants from the crowd of "Our House" and "the People's House" in 1776. But these are borrowed, indeed stolen clothes, because it's a very strange populism that seeks to overthrow the will of the majority as expressed both in popular numbers and in the Electoral College, as we saw on January 6th. And it is a very strange constitutionalism which thoroughly twists and distorts the meaning of the Constitution to introduce a fundamentally anti-constitutional and anti-democratic idea as a doctrine. So what is this insurrectionary doctrine? Well, everyone knows the First Amendment protects the freedom of speech and the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. But do peacefully assembled protesters have an additional Second Amendment right to take up arms against the government and to engage in a violent rebellion or insurrection if they believe the government is behaving unfairly or tyrannically? Now, astonishingly, most MAGA Republicans, including many GOP members of the House that I serve with, or in the US Senate, or state legislatures, say yes. Following the NRA dogma, they've been promoting the insurrectionary theory of the Constitution, nicely expressed by my colleague, Florida Rep. Matt Gaetz, who says that the Second Amendment, quote, is about maintaining within the citizenry the ability to maintain an armed rebellion against the government if that becomes necessary. And this view rejects as way too limited the Supreme Court's 5-4 landmark ruling in Heller versus District of Columbia. And in that 2008 case, the court found that the Second Amendment protects the right of individuals to keep a handgun in the home for purposes of self-defense and the right to possess long-arm rifles for the purposes of hunting and recreation. And Heller indeed broke from the traditional understanding that firearm ownership and possession are tethered to actual service in the military or service in what the Second Amendment calls a well-regulated militia, or what we know today as the National Guard. The insurrectionary theory pushed by Gaetz, and as you'll see many of my colleagues, sweeps much further than even this. The insurrectionary school says that the people, or to be more precise, any armed segment of the population with a grievance, have a Second Amendment right to attack the police and overthrow the government. Colorado Representative Lauren Boebert, my colleague, puts it this way.
This is our check on government. The Second Amendment has nothing to do with hunting, unless you're talking about hunting tyrants, maybe.
And these are concepts frequently invoked in her vernacular. She's described Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer as a tyrant, and she bemoans the tyranny of Colorado Governor Jared Polis. And she vehemently defends the insurrectionist theory of the Constitution when I challenge her about it in the Oversight Committee. Of course, if the meaning of the Second Amendment is to empower the people or an armed subset to violently overthrow the government, then the people must theoretically possess a military arsenal at least equal in quality and quantity to that of the government. Because the people, of course, can't be outgunned if they've got a right to overthrow the government. And indeed, today, there are around 400 million firearms in America possessed by the people, an arsenal which dwarfs the number of guns possessed by the federal government or any state or local government, or all of them combined. Furthermore, the insurrectionary thesis requires opposition to any regulation of heavy arms, like military-style assault weapons like the AR-15, the weapon of choice of mass murderers around the country. No matter how much the civilian carnage piles up in the massacres in schools and churches and synagogues and mosques and Walmarts and grocery stores, because how could the people ever overthrow the tyrants if they didn't possess weapons of lethality equal to those that are available to the National Guard and the Army? So advocates of insurrectionism proudly oppose assault weapon bans, They oppose bump stock bans. They oppose any legislation or regulation that would confine the power of the people to acquire military-grade weapons, declaring all of these to be violations of the Second Amendment. But I want to show you how the claims of my insurrectionist friends completely betray the actual Constitution. So let's start with this basic reality check. Of the more than 1,000 criminal indictments that have been brought against the January 6th defendants for smashing our windows, violently assaulting Capitol officers, or engaging in seditious conspiracy, not a single charge has been dismissed on the grounds that the Second Amendment or any other part of the Constitution gave them the right to overthrow or take up arms against the government. And this is for an excellent reason. Despite all of the romantic, pseudo-revolutionary rhetoric about how the Constitution gives people the right to engage in insurrection, the actual Constitution, in a half dozen different places, treats insurrection and rebellion not as protected rights, but as serious and dangerous offenses against our government and against our people. Let's start with Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15, which gives Congress the power to, quote, provide for calling forth the militia to, 1, execute the laws of the Union, and 2, suppress insurrections, and 3, repel invasions. This provision presents an unresolvable problem for the insurrectionists. How could Congress have the power to mobilize state militias from all over the country to defeat popular insurrections if the people actually have a constitutional right to appoint themselves the militia and then wage insurrection against the government? The Republican Guarantee Clause in Article 4, Section 4 further provides that the United States Congress shall guarantee a Republican form of government to the people and protect each state's government and people against invasion and domestic violence. So the Constitution, again, treats domestic violence as a lethal threat to the continuity of representative government, not some kind of freely available and valid alternative to it. Both of these provisions became part of the Constitution in response to Shays' Rebellion, the armed uprising in Massachusetts in the 1780s, which the founders emphatically rejected and put down with force, both federal and state troops. Thus, the militia, which the insurrectionists invite us to imagine exists as the people's organic power to rebel against the government, is actually the well-organized instrument by which both state and federal governments have suppressed insurrections and opposed domestic political violence. The Constitution simply rejects the right-wing fantasy that random bands of disgruntled citizens can claim powers of the militia, the institutional militia, to commit violent acts against public officials and the police. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 16 reserves to the states the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. It also reserves to Congress the power of organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia. This explicit intergovernmental cooperation is how we come to have what the Second Amendment calls for in its very first clause, a well-regulated militia. The Supreme Court has emphasized that the Second Amendment's reference to a well-regulated militia means well-regulated by the government, not by the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers or the Ku Klux Klan. In 1886, the Supreme Court upheld an Illinois state law banning all private paramilitary groups as a danger to public peace and safety. The court explained that militia-related activities, quote, cannot be claimed as a right independent of law. Under our political system, they are subject to the regulation and control of the state and federal governments, unquote. The American rights recurring post-Oklahoma City bombing, post-Ruby Ridge shootout, post-Waco standoff fantasy of gun-bearing citizens forming a militia and then taking aim at the FBI and the ATF agents reflects not a plan for exercise of some God-given right, but a dangerous recipe for criminal violence and political terrorism, and it's way outside the Constitution. Today, all 50 states forbid private paramilitary groups, a blanket criminal prohibition which would simply be impossible if the Second Amendment authorized private militias to take up arms and start hunting tyrants whenever they disagree with the results of a popular election or a state government's public health policies or whatever. We now need a federal law actually backing up the 50 states on this point, and I'm working on that right now with Senator Ed Markey from Massachusetts. I will go even further on this point. Far from being some kind of civic duty, raising arms against the government when it goes far enough is the very definition of treason. Article 3, Section 3, Clause 1, the only place in the entire Constitution where a criminal offense is defined, provides that, quote, treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. Well, what's a violent insurrection against Congress if not levying war against the country? And yet the insurrectionists invite us to treat treason as some kind of implied constitutional right. There's no ambiguity in the Constitution about this point. After the Civil War, participation in armed rebellion was made explicit grounds for excluding from public office anyone who had sworn an oath to support the Constitution and then betrayed it. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which we treated closely in our last class, permanently disqualifies from future federal or state office any public office holder who engages in insurrection or rebellion against the United States of America. A provision, again, that's totally incompatible with the idea that the Constitution somehow protects our right to wage insurrection or rebellion against our own government. And yet, despite this overwhelming clarity of purpose in the Constitution itself, my MAGA colleagues still insist that the Second Amendment, in invisible ink no less, protects the right of the people to overthrow the government by force and to violently resist police orders in the process. How can this be maintained when the Second Amendment makes no mention at all of insurrection, rebellion, sedition, or secession? The insurrectionists here will strike an originalist pose and imagine that our founders simply wanted the Constitution to give the people the right to violently overthrow the government. Really? Nowhere did the framers express this belief, which is why none of our self-professed originalists offer any authentic original evidence for these radical Second Amendment claims. Nor did the Supreme Court ever hold during the Civil War that the Confederates had a right to overthrow the Union to defeat what they saw clearly as government tyranny. On the contrary, the Supreme Court repeatedly emphasized the government's power under the Supremacy Clause to enforce the law and to quell and put down secession and rebellion. Without any constitutional language or Supreme Court case law to invoke, my colleagues on the MAGA side fall back on two arguments. First, they invoke Patrick Henry of give me liberty or give me death fame. And this was indeed a great Revolutionary War bumper sticker from the Virginian, but it's not a constitutional doctrine. The focus on Patrick Henry is actually kind of amusing because he was, of course, an anti-federalist who voted against the Constitution. The whole thing. His slogans tell us no more about the meaning of the Second Amendment than Robert E. Lee's speeches would tell you about the meaning of the 14th Amendment. I know the George Mason University Antonin Scalia Law School has a Patrick Henry Professor of Constitutional Law and the Second Amendment funded directly by the National Rifle Association, but the NRA romance with Patrick Henry as a guide to constitutional analysis and understanding operates in the realm of pure mythology and not relevant jurisprudence and constitutional analysis. But the insurrectionary theorists also invoke, more plausibly, the American Revolution itself. And they point out that the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, posited that after a long train of abuses and usurpations, the people have a right to alter or abolish the bonds holding them to a tyrannical government. And this is, of course, emphatically true, but it's also perfectly irrelevant. The fact that Thomas Jefferson asserted a natural law right to break from foreign tyranny is completely different from the claim that the founders embodied and encoded in our Constitution, which became binding positive law after the Revolution, a right to violently overthrow our own government. No such right exists, as we've seen. Our Constitution doesn't even guarantee the right to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience, to make specific constitutionally mandated reforms like desegregation of restaurants or lunch counters or elections, as Dr. Martin Luther King and John Lewis and Bob Moses learned from the inside of many a jail cell over many years in the modern civil rights movement. Even when you've got moral and political and legal right on your side, as participants in the civil rights movement did, the courts repeatedly found that sit-in protesters had no right to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience, trespasses, or disruption of the peace, which is why so many brave civil rights protesters spent so many thousands of hours and days in jail. So much less, then, does the Constitution guarantee the right to engage in violent civil disobedience in the form of armed insurrection or rebellion against the government, the kind that we saw on January 6, 2021, in order to entrench injustice and domination. If the American government were to engage in real tyranny, like slaughtering and oppressing the population, the people would undoubtedly, and do undoubtedly, have a natural right after such abuses and usurpations to proclaim our cause to the world, to cut the ties that bind, and to engage in the same kind of revolutionary struggle that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and the American colonists did. But it would be meaningless. It would be silly to argue that the Constitution itself grants us the right to do that in the face of the entire architecture of the Constitution, which opposes insurrection and rebellion and domestic violence. In his first inaugural address, President Lincoln stated that should the people, quote, grow weary of the existing government, they can exercise their constitutional right of amending it or their revolutionary right to dismember or overthrow it. But the revolutionary right is, by definition, not a constitutional right because, as Lincoln put it, quote, no government proper ever had a provision in its organic law for its own termination, it being impossible to destroy it except by some action not provided for in the instrument itself, unquote. The phony insurrectionary theory allows the far right to suggest that the mass destructive violence of January 6th was something other than criminal. But it was criminal. And the way we legitimately pursue grievances about elections in America is through the law and the courts. Trump and his followers brought more than 60 federal and state lawsuits all over America that were meticulously rejected by every court to examine them. They should have taken these losses as proof that no one was buying Trump's big lie, and they should have gone home. Or if they really believed that the courts were stacked against them, even though Trump's claims failed with at least 8 judges he himself nominated to the bench, then the kind of nonviolent civil disobedience Dr. King practiced was surely open to them as an existential option. After all, unlike Trump, the civil rights movement did face biased, prejudiced judges in huge parts of the country who ignored the reality of segregation and the facts of racial violence while betraying the constitutional meaning of equal protection and due process. But that kind of sustained, direct, nonviolent action requires collective nonviolent discipline, an appeal to the truth, and a spirit of actual sacrifice and love for your country, rather than violent hatred of democracy and the people who live within it. Nonviolent and conscientious civil disobedience to demand equal rights has a pretty good track record of success in our country, while bloody insurrection to stage a coup against constitutional democracy has a miserable record of failure. The insurrectionists, hyped up on Trump's lies, never had the discipline or the vision or the courage of the civil rights protesters who transformed America in the last century. Trump and his followers are also calling the convicted January 6 insurrectionists hostages, which is just dumbfounding to me. A hostage is somebody who's been abducted by a terrorist or criminal faction and then held for financial or political ransom. The January 6th insurrectionists are not hostages in any decent use of the word. They were prosecuted under law and with due process rights, and most of them pled guilty to their criminal offenses. Yet Donald Trump repeatedly promises pardons, full pardons, he says, for all of the January 6th defendants, the violent assailants, the seditious conspiracists, everyone who tried to overthrow the 2020 election. And to give the violent insurrectionists even more aid and comfort, the mastermind and inciter-in-chief of January 6th says he'd throw in an apology too. You can see the nearly clairvoyant wisdom of the framers of the 14th Amendment, who insisted that future public office be forbidden to office holders who would dare to incite and foment insurrection against our government. In any event, by refuting and destroying the extreme insurrectionary theory of the Second Amendment, we can finally clear the way for the meaningful gun safety legislation that's been blocked by the MAGA claim that the Constitution is a straitjacket which prevents us from doing anything. Today, gun violence is the leading cause of death for children and young people under 18. We have the highest rates of gun violence in the industrialized world. Every time there's another massacre, whether it's a Buffalo supermarket or an El Paso Walmart or the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh or the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston or high school in Parkland, the Democrats will get up on the floor and we say, this is intolerable and we've got to act. We've got to pass the universal violent criminal background check to close all of the loopholes in background checks, the internet purchase loophole and the private gun show loophole and the friend-to-friend loophole. We've got to pass red flag laws. We've got to ban military-style assault weapons, which Congress had done for more than a decade and it was never struck down. But the Republicans say TNP, thoughts and prayers, TNP for short, it saves time. And nothing can be done because of the Second Amendment. They get up, they say, Raskin wants us to repeal the Second Amendment. And I say, no. I don't want you to repeal the Second Amendment. I want you to read the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Even Justice Scalia himself, in the 5-4 Heller decision, emphasized that although the Second Amendment confers an individual right to bear arms, not tethered to militia service, and that was the radical reversal of the Supreme Court in that 5-4 decision, still, that right is circumscribed and modified and cabined by the public regulatory interest in protecting public safety and public health under the police power. This is the language my colleagues refuse to acknowledge. Here's Justice Scalia, quote, like most rights, the Second Amendment right is not unlimited. It is not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever in any manner whatsoever and for whatever purpose. For example, concealed weapons prohibitions have been upheld under the amendment or state analogs. The court's opinion should not be taken to cast doubt on long-standing prohibitions on the possession of firearms by felons and the mentally ill, or laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places, such as schools and government buildings, or laws imposing conditions and qualifications on the commercial sale of arms. Miller's holding the sorts of weapons protected are those in common use at the time find support in the historical tradition of prohibiting the carrying of dangerous and unusual weapons. Under Scalia's expansive list of exceptions, we have the power to pass criminal background checks, the power to pass a ban on military-style assault weapons like the AR-15, the power to pass red flag laws, and other reasonable public safety measures that don't interfere with the individual rights of self-defense, hunting, or recreation, much less militia service, which was the paradigm core meaning of the Second Amendment. The vast majority of the American people favor such reasonable laws, but we are stymied and hamstrung and straitjacketed by the total intransigence and categorical blockade of the National Rifle Association and the MAGA right. But their opposition to reasonable gun safety laws is based on an intellectual fraud. We need America to see that so we can begin to save lives from the horrors of the worst civilian gun violence in the world. For example, more than 95% of American people favor a universal violent criminal background check. We should be able to get that done. The fraudulent constitutional philosophy of insurrectionism is exacting a brutal toll on the American people and on our social contract by blockading perfectly reasonable and constitutional gun safety measures. The Supreme Court has never struck down background checks or outright bans on the sale and possession of military-style assault weapons or red flag laws. And yet, my GOP colleagues will immediately leap to their feet and describe all of them as violations of the Second Amendment. They want to believe that the purpose of the Second Amendment is to keep the public armed to the teeth so we can overthrow our own government. With gun violence out of control in America, the great American majority, which favors not only the rule of law, but universal criminal background checks and a ban on the sale of military-style assault weapons to civilians, must make it plain to the apologists for insurrection in Congress and all of the extremist groups how our Constitution and how our society really work. There is no lawful right to overthrow the government or attack our police or obstruct the counting of votes in a presidential election in America. The alleged rights of insurrection and sedition do not exist in the Second Amendment or anywhere else in our Constitution. We are governed here by our Constitution and the nonviolent social contract that is developed and defined under it. It is time to reassert the primacy of the real Constitution as a searchlight and an agent of democratic progress against all the dark nihilism and violence and insurrectionism of our times.
Well, now, Congressman, I definitely have some questions here, given that we're talking about perversions of the Second Amendment by the right. But before we get into that, there is a reason that we're doing this series, and it's to promote an amazing organization that you work with called Democracy Summer. So can you give a quick shout out for Democracy Summer and let folks who are watching right now know how they can help?
Well, in Democracy Summer, and thank you, Brian, we're mobilizing, we hope, thousands of high school students and college students and people in that age group to come and to participate with us in a movement to defend democracy and freedom in America. And we have nationwide Zoom sessions during the weeks with historians like the great Tim Snyder, constitutional law people like Larry Tribe, political theorists and scientists, great organizers, great elected officials, Nancy Pelosi, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Maxwell Frost, who of course is the first Gen Z member of Congress, the youngest member of Congress, and he is co-leading Democracy Summer with me. But we are doing these classes and seminars during the week, and then for the rest of the time, the Democracy Summer Fellows are off with a particular campaign. They are canvassing, they are knocking on doors, they're doing digital organizing, they are raising money and hell for a democratic victory and sweep all across America in 2024. So we're in, I believe, 42 or 43 states right now. We're hoping to be in all 50 states by the time we get to the summer. And so we're encouraging everybody to check out Democracy Summer. We'd love to have you working with us.
And of course, I'll put the link to Democracy Summer right here on the screen, also in the post description of this video. So for anybody watching right now, please check it out. That's a great way to support the work that the congressman's doing. Now, the Second Amendment guarantees that a well-regulated militia shall not be infringed. That's the language in the Second Amendment. The argument can very, very easily be made that what we have in today's smattering of often mentally ill lone wolf shooters is anything but a well-regulated militia. So can you speak on that? Because that's the principal justification that conservatives use to allow for this proliferation of weaponry into our society.
Well, for most of American history, the Supreme Court thought that the Second Amendment right was attached only to militia service. And so if you were in a militia, you were part of the people engaged in collective self-defense. And so your guns couldn't be removed from you. After the Heller decision, it changed. It was controversial. The 4 more liberal members of the court wanted to stick with that collective self-defense interpretation of the Second Amendment. But the conservatives who won in the decision said, no, it is an individual right. And they cited the right of self-defense that people have. And so they struck down the essential ban on handguns that existed in the District of Columbia. And they said there's also a right of people to possess long-arm rifles for the purposes of hunting and recreation. So it's not just the militia right, but also self-defense and hunting and recreation were built into it. And yet, even there, Justice Scalia went to great pains to point out that this right of individual gun ownership was not unlimited, and it could be cabined by the public's right of collective community safety, public safety and public security and public health. And so now the court has gone on in another decision called Bruin to give a kind of historical test to it, saying that different public safety and public health restrictions have to be read through the prism of history and how governments have treated that before. I'm not quite sure how that historical test is going to work out. In any event, the point is that it's nothing like the unlimited right to guns that's posited by those people who are claiming that the Second Amendment means the people have the right to overthrow the government. Because if you have the right to overthrow the government, then you have to have a right to everything the government has. Not just rifles and handguns, but also assault weapons and tanks and who knows, nuclear weapons. And you can see where that goes. That can't be a proper interpretation of the Second Amendment. It is not a proper interpretation of the Second Amendment, and it doesn't make sense when you read the whole Constitution. And that's simply what I've been trying to point out today, Brian, that there are all these other elements in the Constitution which cut against the idea that there's a right to engage in insurrection against your own government.
Well, I want to go back to that Heller opinion, and specifically by one of the most conservative justices to ever sit on the court, and that's Antonin Scalia, who you just spoke about, and him saying, quote, like most rights, the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited. Nothing in our opinion should be taken to cast doubt on the long-standing prohibitions of the possession of firearms by felons and the mentally ill, or laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places such as schools and government buildings. Can you speak on just how far the Overton window has shifted in just the last few years when this is what conservatives were saying just 15 years ago?
Well, that's a great point, Brian. I mean, it is a statement, I suppose, of the rapid descent of the Republican Party. Because like I was saying, I just quoted you 4 or 5 examples, but I could give you dozens of examples. There are Republicans who will literally tell you there is nothing that can be done, which is why they give only thoughts and prayers when there's a massacre or when, the daily death toll goes over 170 or 180 people who are slaughtered. I mean, this is routine now all over the country, in the big cities, in the small towns, the urban areas, the rural and suburban areas. It's the same thing. We are experiencing an absolute slaughter, and the rest of the world looks at our country like there's something really wrong with us. Because what they're depriving us of is the basic meaning of the social contract. If you read the social contract theorists like John Locke or Hobbes or Rousseau, all of them say the same thing. We exchange violent self-defense rights for the rights of living in a civil society because we'll be much safer that way. Hobbes said that we leave the state of nature, which is a state of war, for the social contract. But then under the social contract, we've got to give ourselves security. But how much security is there when any maniac can go buy an AR-15 and show up in a first grade or in a Walmart or in a city hall or in a shopping mall? So the whole point of the social contract is destroyed because they are interpreting the Second Amendment in a completely perverse way. They want to say that the meaning of the Second Amendment is that the people have to have the same means of violence that the government has in order to overthrow the government. That's totally antithetical to the meaning of our history, the meaning of the text of the Constitution, and the meaning of all the Supreme Court decisions since then. It seems like a ridiculous thing almost to have to puncture, but it is true that the NRA, the GOP, and the MAGA right now say that the meaning of the Second Amendment is the people have to have means to the weaponry to overthrow the government. And if that's the case, all is lost. There is no way we're going to be able to stop the constant slaughter that's taking place in the roads and the streets of America.
We know Republicans have given a raft of excuses for shootings over the years, and those range from video games to mental health to the degradation of the nuclear family to godlessness, and then most recently to too many doors and entrances. So did it surprise you to learn that we were the only country with the uniquely American problem of too many doors in the world?
Well, you are correct, Brian, that whenever a massacre takes place, whenever a shooting takes place, they will come up with a new explanation. Except there's one explanation they'll never come up with, which is that it has to do with the ready availability of guns in our society. And of course, every study has shown that that's the difference. We don't have higher rates of mental and emotional health problems than other parts of the world. It's not that we are less religious than other parts of the world. On the contrary, none of the things that they throw out makes any sense, because they're throwing out everything but the truth, which is that it is the ready availability and access to guns that explains why we're in such a different situation than people in Canada or people in the UK or people in England or Japan. That's the difference, and everybody knows it. But for them, the cause of our terrible rates of gun homicide and gun violence are basically irrelevant, because they follow the political will of the gun manufacturers who are in this for profit and business. And for them, they assert this absurd categorical Second Amendment position, which is there's nothing that can be done, because any gun safety rule you try to put in today will violate the Second Amendment right of the people to assemble arsenals that will allow them to overthrow the government.
Well, when your Republican colleagues scapegoat mental health, for example, as the real reason for gun violence, how do they reconcile that with that party's then overwhelming unwillingness to actually fund mental health programs?
Well, they don't try to pretend to have any kind of coherent public philosophy or analysis. They will say in the case of a Walmart shooting or a shooting in the Buffalo grocery store, oh, well, this is a mental health problem, we should deal with mental health. But then when you actually try to deal with mental health, they're happy to say that this is not the proper role of government and this is what churches should do. Sometimes they will say, after an episode of gun violence or a massacre, that the problem is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court banned prayer in the public schools in 1962, and that they will blame it on the Supreme Court. Of course, the Supreme Court never banned prayer in the public schools. As long as there are pop math quizzes, there will be prayer in the public schools. Anybody can pray whenever he or she wants to pray. It's just the government can't compel you to pray. But when there's a massacre and they blame it on the lack of school prayer, it doesn't explain why kids at a private religious school who just prayed moments before have been slaughtered. And that happened in Tennessee. We have people praying at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, who are killed by a white supremacist racist invoking the Great Replacement theory that's so popular on the MAGA right. We have people at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh who were praying, literally praying, when they were wiped out by an anti-Semite with an AR-15. So, it's fine for people to believe that prayers will be answered, but they certainly haven't been answered quickly enough to prevent someone with an AR-15 to mow down people who are praying, or kids who are in school, or people who are shopping at a Walmart.
Now, the NRA used to be against the mentally ill buying guns or abusers being able to buy guns, but it seems like now their only goal is to just assist in the proliferation of gun ownership with no limits on anyone, anywhere, whatsoever. So I'm not trying to ask you to get into their heads here, but what's the upside of such an extreme position, one where the majority of Americans actually disagree?
Well, the NRA and the gun manufacturers who are really subsidizing them and promoting them want everybody to be in a state of fear and anxiety. So they've got to tell gun owners, no, we can't close the loopholes in the Brady law to have an effective universal violent criminal background check, because that will lead to confiscation of everybody's guns. Of course, confiscating people's guns is totally unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court would never have it, so it's a ridiculous argument. But they've got to make people believe, if we have red flag laws, as many states do have red flag laws, that means everybody's going to lose their guns. And it's ridiculous. So they are mobilizing people's fear and anxiety in order to keep them in a state in which they're willing to keep funding the NRA. The NRA is in a lot of trouble now because its president and CEO was essentially looting the organization. There have been millions and millions of dollars lost and lots of private corruption taking place there. The truth is that Second Amendment rights are perfectly secure in America. We've got more guns in our society than any society on earth has. People are going to be able to do all their hunting and recreation, and people are going to be able to have handguns for self-defense. And it unfortunately will cost us a lot more lives than other civilized countries have to put up with. But we can still dramatically reduce the amount of gun-related homicides and violence in the country by getting rid of assault weapons. Why do we need weapons of war on the streets of America? Why do we need weapons of war being taken into schools and city halls? It just makes no sense. Why do we need weapons of war in shopping malls? That just makes no sense. So we can get rid of some of the extremist policies that have been entrenched by the NRA while still protecting everybody's Second Amendment rights. But they want to make you believe that if we pass reasonable gun safety legislation, that somehow people will not be able to go hunting or participate in firearms recreation anymore. It's not true. It's just wrong, and it's time for us to stop that lie. And it's also time for us to debunk the fraud of the insurrectionary theory of the Second Amendment.
Perfectly put. We'll leave it there. And look, this is an issue that never seems to go away. So for folks watching right now, use this video as a resource. There's no better authority on the Constitution than the guy who literally taught the Constitution as a professor. Really, the way that we kind of beat back disinformation is by arming ourselves with factual information. And I hope that we were able to do a little bit of that today. So with that said, we've got more coming up. Congressman, can you give us a quick look at what we should expect next time?
Yes, and let me just say thank you for your kind words, Brian, but I am just one of hundreds or thousands of constitutional law professors in the country, so definitely be sure to check out what other people have written or said about this. And I've read the cases and I've studied what I can, but there are people who have written books about this. Certainly check out Carl Bogus's book on the subject. There's very good information you can get from the groups out there. So thank you, Brian. I'm very excited for our class next time, where we're going to look at the Foreign Government Emoluments Clause and the Domestic Emoluments Clause, and we're going to try to explode the right-wing fallacy that the President of the United States can collect whatever money he wants from foreign kings and princes and states, so long as he doesn't accept his official federal salary for being president, and as long as he makes voluntary payments to the government of what he considers the profits from his receipt of emoluments from foreign governments. So we're going to take that fallacy directly head on. We're going to look at the report of the Democrats on the House Oversight Committee, which documents nearly $8 million in foreign government emoluments and payments that President Trump received from kings and princes and foreign governments. So we're going to look at all of the Emoluments Clause violations of the former president, and we're going to explain why it's a fallacy that he did not violate the Constitution simply because he refused to take his federal salary.
Great. And you can check out that episode by, again, subscribing to this channel. And as always, to support this series, please check out Democracy Summer Up with the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Teller Cohen.
And I'm Jamie Raskin.
And this is Class with Jamie Raskin.